Welcome back. How will the GOP tax plan affect you? Well, it depends what part you play in the tale of two suncoasts. Married taxpayers earning $42,000 to $200,000 will have a tax rate of about 25%. Couples earning between $500,000 to $1 million a year will pay almost 40%. Some popular deductions, however, will be out. To middle-class families, like the deduction for medical expenses, student loan interest, tax prep expenses, moving expenses, unreimbursed employee expenses, and lifetime learning credits, employer-provided tax care credits, all out. The property tax deduction is still in, but it will be capped at $10,000 a year, and the estate tax, better known as the death tax, will be phased out. And joining us for more is Rod Thompson, the president of the Sarasota Republican Club, former state representative Keith Fitzgerald, and Michael Snipes, the economics instructor at USF Sarasota Manatee. And Michael, I want to start with you, and I don't know if it's too early to ask this question, but in terms of the impact on the economy, what are you seeing?
Well, it is a little too early to say. I mean, there's still a lot of people, there's still a lot of analysts out there who are still doing a lot of the work and seeing exactly what the numbers are going to shake out to be. But if it does go through in its current form, one of the things that we need to take into account is kind of what does this mean for the entire economy? Because we're proposing all of these tax cuts, but we have to make up for those tax cuts with cuts in other places. Essentially, you have to pay for tax cuts with other tax cuts. And what matters for most people and what matters for the economy is what exactly is getting cut, right? So if we're talking about increasing the standard deduction, which is essentially a kind of a tax cut, or we're talking about cutting corporate tax rates, how much of an effect is that going to have on the average citizen as opposed to the things that we're cutting to pay for those cuts, like some of the things that were proposed?
Rod, I saw a Republican congressman in the story a few minutes ago who noted that under this plan it adds about $1 trillion to the national debt. I thought you guys were against that.
Yeah, and we go through this every time too. And the problem is the way that we gauge these things. And as an economist at the table here, I'll wade into it a little bit. But not using dynamic scoring with these sort of things makes no sense to me whatsoever. When you use a static model, thinking that if you cut $1 trillion, that will not affect people's actions in any ways is just not living in the real world. So if it could be gauged with, well, all right, you're cutting $1 trillion, that's keeping $1 trillion in the economy in a market-oriented way. That's going to generate more economic activity. That generates more tax revenue. So in that respect, I don't think that that's probably a good number. In fact, CBO has a pretty good track record of getting a lot of these wrong, and Obamacare wrong. It's just so hard when they're hemmed in by having to measure it in that sort of way.
Keith?
Well, if you actually look at the dynamic scoring, it has been done by some analysts, and it actually shows that it will raise the deficit a little more than a little less. So dynamic scoring makes a lot of sense in some respects, but this case, it doesn't work out. Look, the whole rationale of this thing is that we'll have sustained 4% growth. We have a declining population, and there is no way that you're going to have 4% growth when one of the major variables is population. So unless our friends on the Republican side want to increase immigration by a huge amount, 4% growth over 10 years is not possible.
Michael, this is an argument that is ages old in terms of whether tax cuts are going to, that it's predictable in terms of what it will do in terms of the growth of the economy. I believe the first George Bush called it voodoo economics. Mm-hmm. Am I correct?
I believe that's correct, yeah. And the whole idea, I mean, it seems relatively straightforward, right? If we cut taxes, then that gives more money to people, gives more money to corporations, then that should get invested back into the economy, and then that reinvestment in the economy grows the economy, and it kind of trickles down. That's
Does it work?
Came from. Historically, there's not a lot of evidence that it has worked. And one thing that we do need to be careful of is that when we say that we're going to be cutting taxes, we need to be clear about what taxes are being cut. Because what tends to happen is we just kind of throw out a blanket statement, we're cutting taxes.
We only have a few seconds left, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
If you look at the 60s through the 80s, we didn't have particularly strong economic growth. When you had that 2-year attempt to finally get dramatic tax reform, which this would be the most dramatic since then during the Reagan years, we had sustained growth, obviously with the ups and downs, but we had sustained economic growth at a much higher level, and I think it's hard to say that that had nothing to do with the dramatic tax cuts of the 80s.
Obviously, we are just getting warmed up here. We'll have more on the GOP tax reform plan right after we check the first alert weather, so stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about the new GOP tax reform plan, and joining us for more is Rod Thompson, the president of the Sarasota Republican Club, former state representative Keith Fitzgerald, and Michael Snipes, an economics instructor at USF Sarasota Manatee. And Keith, I'm going to start with you because the predictions are this tax reform package is going to get very few, if any, Democratic votes. It's hard. You'd be hard pressed to find people out in our community who think that they are paying too much in taxes. So why not do what you can to give families like yours a tax cut?
Well, you have to have the right plan. I mean, I actually agree with that if you have the right plan. This plan is not the right plan. And one of the reasons it's not going to pass is because it blows up the deficit in a gigantic way. And it cannot pass in its present form because of that fact.
Michael, we also saw in the story a little bit early that the typical family, at least what Republicans are saying, will save about $1,100 a year, if not a little bit more. What impact does that have in terms of the economy and the impact in terms of families in general?
I think there's two parts to that. One is, how are you defining a typical family? I mean, are we talking about median income, which is about $45,000? Is that a typical family? Is that who we're calling typical? Are we calling somebody who's earning $75,000? Are they a typical family? So it matters kind of who you're calling typical. And if we're giving $1,000, let's just call it $1,100 to someone who's at the lower income bracket, then that certainly might have an impact on them, but that's going to be very different if you give that same $1,100 to somebody who's earning $75,000. So it matters how you classify things. It matters how you classify people, because that's going to influence how big those returns are.
All right. Rod, make a point, and then I have a question.
I have an objection to the premise that for the $1 trillion deficit hole, because that assumes that we can't and won't cut spending in Washington, D.C. That's probably a safe assumption in the political realm, but there's no reason why that should be the case. For the last 9 years or more, Americans have been living with tightened belts. A lot of middle-class Americans, a lot of Sarasotans have been living on less. And I think a lot of us get frustrated to think that there's no way, apparently, Washington can ever not always have more. Well, yeah, we're going to have deficits at some point if we try and do any tax cuts, if we won't cut spending.
Let me ask you this question, because I went through some of the things that will be going away, and that includes the deductions for student loan interest, tax prep expenses, moving expenses, unreimbursed employee expenses, and alimony. A lot of middle-class, working-class families have looked forward to those deductions to bump up their returns a little bit. What say you?
Well, I mean, okay, that's for those who do a full deduction, and obviously there's plenty of middle-class ones that don't do the full deductions, that take the standard deductions. But for those who use the full deductions and use those sorts of things, that would impact them. But that, as I understand it, is mitigated by other parts of the plan where you have tax cuts that favor those same families. So, you know, you have to take the package as a whole. If you take individual pieces, you're always going to have individual oxes gored. I mean, my gosh, I wouldn't want to be somebody making decent money owning a home in California under this plan, because you'll get crushed. You know, because you're getting rid of the income tax deduction.
Michael, I know you wanted to make a point, and then let's get into the politics of this.
Yeah, well, it really does kind of matter, because if we're planning on paying for a lot of these things, then we have to project into the future 4 years, and that's very difficult to do. And a lot of the tax cuts that are being proposed, you know, we're proposing getting rid of things that really would help middle income class individuals, like student loan interest. That's something that really could make an impact on most people. If we get rid of that, that's something that is going to hurt the people that is at least nominally intended to help.
Keith, let me ask you this, because I have an ongoing conversation with my best friend John about these things, and when the issue of whether or not this would cap contributions to 401ks, in the end, President Trump objected to that. It is not in this plan, so therefore, what's your objection to this?
Well, my objection to this plan is that it doesn't really do anything good. You know, if you're middle class, it really depends what your life circumstances are, whether you're going to win or you're going to lose. Some millions of people will win, millions of people lose. What there is no question about is that it represents a major transfer of wealth to the top 1% of the population, and that's not what we need after 30 years of growing inequality. And inequality is It's not, I'm not arguing for leveling or anything for that. It creates substantive problems, including in the economy, because it distorts the way people spend money in ways and tends to sort of cycle.
Rod, short answer, and then I want to take a poll.
Okay. Short answer for what?
When
I'm
you
sorry.
were bowing your head to what Keith was saying.
I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought there.
Okay. Then when we talk about the politics of this just for one moment, the three of you, raise your hands if you think this tax plan is going to pass as is.
No.
No.
Why?
Okay, it's the dynamics of the Senate. You have a 52-48 Republican. Susan Collins is a liberal, so nothing conservative. That makes it 51-49. You have Rand Paul, who's a conservative libertarian, who's a Puritan about it, which means if it's not pure enough, it won't pass him. That puts it at 50-50. That means the anti-Trump caucus, led by John McCain, can scuttle anything. I don't see any way it gets over 50.
Keith?
Well, some of it has to do with process. I know it's a little boring, but when Rod said government keeps growing and growing and growing, remember a couple of weeks ago they passed a budget, and that budget calls for $1.5 trillion loss in expenditures. But this tax plan, when it's scored, turns out to cost somewhere between $3.5 and $5 trillion over 10 years' time. And under the rules, if you're going to use reconciliation, those numbers have to match. So they're not even in the ballpark getting close to being able to do it under reconciliation. And that's 50-50, and they're not going to find 61
Michael,
votes.
I'm not going to ask you the political question, but I'm wondering, as an economist, in the community of economists, this has not been scored yet by the Congressional Budget Office. When the last time there was major tax reform in the Reagan era, it was bipartisan, and it took 2 years to accomplish, and the president wants this on his desk by Christmas.
Sure. Yeah, and that's another reason why I think it's unlikely to really gain any real traction and pass anytime soon, because there's not enough time to really go through all of the nuance and all of the economic implications. For a bill of this magnitude, you have to be very careful and deliberate as to what exactly is in there before it gets implemented.
So, gentlemen, what would you say to the vast audience of ours who are watching tonight and say, we want tax cuts, we want the government to stop spending so much money? Here we have an opportunity, and the three of you, Republican, Democrat, and the economists, are saying it's not going to happen right now.
It's not going to happen in this makeup. The only way that happens, in my humble opinion, is more conservative Republicans to be elected, because they're on board with both cutting government and cutting taxes. If you elect Democrats, it will never happen.
Keith?
I have a completely different perspective on this, but it's not on the other end of the spectrum. I think the problem is Congress is broken. It cannot pass a bill like this. And one of the big problems is something that economists call rent seeking. There are so many special interest groups fighting for little goodies in this thing that you're never going to get it. I think we'd probably agree we want a clean, clear, transparent tax code. But going through Congress, Republican or Democrat, that's not going to
I would
happen.
take a postcard
Well, let me
tax
just
code.
ask you this one second, Keith, that if you had the Democratic majority in Congress and the Democratic president for that matter, would you get a tax reform package?
I'm speaking more as a political scientist and a political guy. The way Congress is presently constituted, I don't think either party can get this done. So you have to change the rules.
Well, that takes the parties to change the rules.
Yeah, but there are huge political implications for the Republicans if nothing gets done, given the fact that we have not passed health care reform. Keith, so what are Republicans like yourself on the Suncoast saying?
Well, the problem is the dynamics that I laid out there. Here's my frustration with it, is that most of the Republicans in both the Senate and the House have actually kept to their promises. But because the margins are so close, it only takes a few that have flipped. That means it looks like all Republicans won't keep their promises. And that's what it looks like.
All right, we have to take a quick break, but we'll be back for final thoughts when we return. Stay with us. And our guest joining us right now for final thoughts. Michael, we have a tax reform plan on the table here. The hope is that we could get growth in our country over 3 to 4%. Given what the package is right now and what most people desire in terms of growth, what does an economist say in terms of the answer?
Well, it sounds low. 3 to 4% growth sounds low. But for a country the size of the United States, 3 to 4% growth is actually pretty high. That's a pretty high number. And if you want to accomplish a growth of 3 to 4% for a country like the United States, I don't know if that's necessarily something that can be driven by just tax policy alone.
Keith?
I don't think this is going to pass. I think it is a big problem for Republicans. And when you give one-party control of government, and they don't really accomplish much of anything except cause a whole bunch of upset because their president doesn't know how to behave like an adult. They're going to pay for it in the polls. So I don't think we're going to get any sensible tax policy, whether you're right or left, liberal or conservative, out of this group. They're the gang that can't shoot straight.
I think you can potentially see 3 to 4% growth, but I think tax reform alone is not enough. I think that's one component. I think another component is deregulation, which some of that can be done in the executive branch.
Are you concerned that you hear a lot of the predictions that the Republican Congress and this Republican president has to pass something?
Right. I mostly hear that out of the pundit class, which we're kind of in right here, and out of the media, and out of those who follow politics closely. I am not sure, I'm not convinced at all, that that's where your average American stands on these things, and the ones that vote, too. So, yes, as a political insider, it really, it worries me that we could get slammed for that, because historically that sort of happened. But I think we are in relatively unhistoric times with this president and this level of division, and I'm not sure that we get our fingers on the pulse of the American people at all like we think we might.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. But before we go, we want to share with you what some of you had to say about last night's show on the efforts to build a new stadium for the Tampa Bay Rays. The Rays have the lowest attendance in baseball, and many blame the low attendance on Tropicana Field. A site in downtown Tampa has been identified as a possible spot for a new stadium. Vicky says no issue with the stadium. If they build a new one, great. If it is an outdoor stadium in this heat, humidity, and thunderstorms, I'm out. Mary says tax dollars should never go towards paying for a new sports stadium. The team owners want a new stadium. Let them pay for it themselves. Apparently Michael agrees with that. And Bob says put the money into the best baseball team and coaching staff possible. Create a solid multi-year winner on the field, and people will come. Selling off players and letting one of the best baseball managers leave the game is not going to bring out the fans. A fantastic new ballpark will only go so far and attract attendance. From Joe Madden? Well, if you'd like to join the conversation on tonight's topic, just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/mysuncoast.com.abc7. And FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And just a reminder, if you want to stay up to date on the latest breaking and local news and see our alerts on your phone instantly, iPhone and iPad users will need to download our new news app. Just go to the App Store and search for WWSB or My Suncoast. Android users, never mind, you'll just get the new version automatically. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight. Rod Thompson is the president of the Sarasota Republican Club, former state representative Keith Fitzgerald, and Michael Snipes, an economics instructor at USF Sarasota Manatee.